I wanted to start out by saying it's not a coincidence that we're having this discussion at UNRISD for two reasons. One is that the motto of UNRISD is about development for social change and research for social change. And what the book and I think all of us are about is really how can we find policies, how can we assess policies that are trying to further social change. The other reason it's not entirely a coincidence is that actually the topic of this particular book owes a lot to Sarah Cook, who at one point with Hook-Joo Kwan, and Sarah Cook is the director of, before she was the director of UNRISD, together with Hook-Joo Kwan, was working on, I think you call it the geography of welfare states, and which actually inspired me to look at, is there not just an East Asian experience and, you know, a Northern, Middle, and Southern European experience of welfare provisioning or social policy, you know, however way we want to call it, but is there also something peculiar to South Asia? And the reason I worked on South Asia is one, that there was this gap. There's no UNRISD book on South Asia, on the welfare state or the social policy in South Asia. And the other was that I worked with a UNICEF regional office for a few years and noticed, and this was from 2005 onwards, noticed how there was so much policy change happening in South Asia and felt this is something worth documenting and advertising. Il-chung has already sort of talked about what is the frame, the theoretical frame, and one question that sort of guided the conceptualization of the book was about, is there something like a common set of ideas and norms that underlie development and welfare policy in South Asia? Are we seeing a typical South Asian developmental welfare state? So is there something, just like there's an East Asian and different European models, is there also a South Asian approach to social policy or to the welfare state? And then, very importantly, is there something like a rights-based approach to social policy? And I'll try and give my answers to those questions at the end, but then it's really about discussing that in this forum. Welfare states, developmental welfare states, what do we mean? And Il-chung Yi has already said something, but very simplistically, a welfare state, in my interpretation, would be about delivering social policy, education, health, goods and services, income transfers during recession to citizens. A developmental welfare state, as you've already said, would be all of that, plus looking at ways of promoting economic growth through policies, either an industrial policy, active labor market policies, structural transformation. But a rights-based developmental state would not be as authoritarian as many of the developmental welfare states of the 1990s were, but actually look at citizens. And I can sort of return your favor, Il-chung, and say that there's a new book also by Il-chung on learning from the South Korean developmental experience, but with a very interesting chapter on the capacity-building version of a developmental welfare state, which I think is very much the direction that Deepta Chopra, my co-editor, and I are also going into. What are rights, and how does a government, how does the state build the empowerment and the capacity of the citizens and the residents to actually claim their rights to social provisioning. But before I talk more on what's happening in South Asia at the policy level, just a few things on understanding the region. Because I think, I don't know where you all sort of come from intellectually and sort of in terms of areas, of regions you know, but South Asia is often perceived as very stellar with high growth and all the innovations, you know, from Bollywood creativity to IT technology in Bangalore. But if we look beneath that shiny surface, it's actually a very deprived region. 80% of the population have less than $2 a day. 40% have less than $1.25, which I don't even think is something worth talking about because it's so low, it's below existence, as it were. But 80% with less than $2 a day, which is quite significant, and which I think is not in the common perception of what South Asia is like. Child malnutrition, 45% as a regional average. Adult hunger or under provision of calories, 40%. So there's very high deprivations in the region. The Human Development Index is very varied, so we see some very high-performing countries like Sri Lanka and Maldives, both high because of their per capita incomes, but also high in the Human Development Index because of the social outcomes in education and health. And then the middle field, surprising, even India is in the middle, not in the high range of human development. I think one would expect to see it higher up. And very important to understand South Asia is social exclusion. And so I find, as an approximation, the Gender Inequality Index that UNDP has developed very useful. The Human Development Index, as everybody in the room knows, the closer, the higher up, the better. The Gender Inequality Index, the closer to one, the worse you are, the worse the country is in terms of gender equality. It measures empowerment of women, health issues, reproductive health, and income and the wage gap. This Gender Inequality Index shows that all the countries in South Asia have a big issue with gender equality. It doesn't show us, and that's a very difficult issue to measure, other forms of social exclusion, identity-based exclusion around ethnicity, around language, around religion. And I see Susan Durston coming, who was in the same office in South Asia and worked very much on inequities in education based on gender and caste and religion and other markers of social exclusion. And then just very quickly on income inequality, any Gini index over 0.3 shows high income inequality. We see in South Asia all the countries are at 0.3 and above, but some improvement over the past 5 years, possibly, and that's a question that the book does not go into, related to the social policies that were introduced. Just to give an image of what we're looking at, again, sort of to undermine the stellar notion of South Asia, when we're talking about health, we're not just talking about, clinics being in place and doctors working and medication being hopefully free, but it's actually, if you need to get to a clinic in a rural part of Nepal, you might not even have public transport, and you might have to resort to being carried on some neighbor's or your husband's back. So it's a very dire situation. Now, turning to innovations in social policy in South Asia, I'm looking at 2004 onwards, and I'll say more why that period later. We see a whole range of policies that have been introduced over the past 10 years in South Asia. The first set are the obvious social policy areas, looking at hunger, looking at health, income insecurity or poverty, unemployment and housing. That's sort of the conventional range, if you will, of social policies. And we see in every one of these areas a lot of the countries have introduced quite astonishing innovations. There's cooked school meals for every child in a government school in India, and there are a lot of children in India and a lot of public schools. There's a national food security bill in India and something similar in Bangladesh, which means there's a right to food, and it's subsidized prices of the main food items, the main grains that people eat, wheat or rice, depending on the region. There's a means-tested food subsidy even in Sri Lanka, which is in the higher Human Development Index group. On health, everywhere it's about universalizing access to health services. In Nepal, for instance, there's now, in Nepal, India, and Bhutan, there's a policy adopted recently to actually have free access to medication. As you know, in many countries, out-of-pocket payments for health are one of the prime drivers of a family or a community falling into poverty. Income security, there's different programs. The first two, the Pakistan and Nepal one, I'll say a bit more in a moment. Very interesting again in India, a social security bill for the sort of what they call the unorganized sector, the informal economy, which, depending on which statistics you use, is between 75 and 95% of the population, guaranteeing some form of minimum social pension for people in the informal economy, some form of maternity leave payments, and some form of accident insurance. It was only adopted in 2013. It's very recent. There's a universal old age pension in Nepal, and wouldn't expect that every citizen in Nepal over a certain age actually has a right to a pension. The most famous policies, and I presume most of you in the room know about the Mahatma Gandhi Rural Employment Scheme, so I won't talk about that a lot. But some of the key components are a minimum wage of that particular state in which it's executed. You can claim for a social transfer if you don't find employment on a public works scheme, and it's 100 days because one has the assumption that if a rural person in a poor rural area has 100 days of work out of 365 days, that would be enough to keep them just above the poverty level. Interestingly, a 100 days work scheme has also been adopted in Bangladesh and in the poorest area of Nepal, so there's also policy diffusion. Housing, very interesting again, India with this urban renewal mission, which is about looking at slums, because many policies in many countries are about the urban poor and about socially excluded people, but there's not a lot of government policy level type of attention to slums. It tends to be more of an NGO type of issue. So this is important to have a government policy adopted on that. So those are sort of conventional areas of social policy, the big point being the surge in the number of policies adopted. But what is interesting from the South Asia perspective, in my perception, in my view, is that social exclusion features very prominently. A lot of education grants are specifically for girl children, for the disadvantaged caste children, trying to give incentives to family and empower families to actually be able to send their children to school. There's a new, also from 2013 or 2012, act in India on tribal communities having a right to the forest in which they live, to harvest the resources of the forest, to actually have their villages there and to not be chased away by soldiers and police. And in India there's also a grant for children, an education grant and a sort of an enterprise grant for people from disadvantaged or religious minorities, which would be Muslims, very interesting in the current discussion in India, Christians and other minority religions. So social exclusion is a big element in characterizing the South Asian model of welfare state or social policy. And then the last column is possibly or probably the most important, and there it's about rights. And what is common to all of the countries in South Asia in this recent surge of social policy is that they're all using the concept of a right to employment, a right to food, a right to a midday meal. They're government acts from parliament or from Supreme Courts, and it's very much using the notion of social justice and of being policies that the citizens can claim for if they're not prohibited. And a key one of these rights is the right to information. The Right to Information Act, which 3 countries have adopted, Bangladesh, Nepal, and India, which is about the right of citizens to get information. The Mahatma Gandhi employment scheme has a very, very sophisticated website. Who's seen that? Who's looked at that website here in the room? It's really impressive because if we were speaking any of the Indian languages, we could also go to that language. And I guess with the code, you can then actually look at, in my village, who else is receiving employment on this public works scheme. And then you can see, are people who don't really exist receiving this wage, or is it actually the people who want the job, and what wage have they been receiving? And if one finds irregularities, obviously as a poor informal sector day worker, you probably don't have access to the internet and maybe not even be literate enough to operate the functions, but there are many civil society organizations who've actually made it their cause to help people to be able to claim their rights by using this kind of information. And by making it, by the government committing it to the information being in the public domain, it's changed very much how citizens view their government and what the government is meant to be delivering. I want to say a bit more about two programs that I find very interesting. One is the child grant or child protection grant that Nepal introduced in 2009. Has anyone been to Nepal here in the room? It's one of the poorest, least developed countries globally. It has, very few resources overall, and nevertheless introduced a child benefit in 2009 that's now going to 500,000 children in the country. So it's a quite big scheme for a small country with a population of, I think, 26 million. It's $2 per child under 5, up to 2 children per family. We can talk about why that limitation later. And there's, it's a slot in the government budget. So it's not coming from the World Bank, it's not money coming from NGOs, it's in the fiscal budget. So it's something that would be difficult to remove. And it's implemented by the Ministry of Local Development with the attempt to really be at the village level again, so people can claim their entitlements. It's very much about the money, the 200 rupees, which is not a lot of money, but about this cash. And it's also very much about nutrition. So an element in this child protection grant was really to improve the nutrition of children under 5. So it's accompanied by all kinds of campaigns and radio information and leaflets about how to nourish your children in a healthy fashion with low income from the resources in the village environment. So this woman is just getting some, a briefing, as it were, on healthy foods for a child that's being weaned. The other program that I find very interesting and what's also important about the child grant is that it has this social inclusion emphasis, because it's universal in the poorest region, so you might call it geographical targeting, in the poorest western districts of the country, and then it's targeted, although I don't like that word, to children in low-income families of the most disadvantaged group, with the caste of the Dalit, in the rest of the country. And similarly, from a social inclusion perspective of social policy, the Benazir Income Support Grant is very, I think, an innovation that's important to recognize. Who's been to Pakistan? Gender is a huge issue in Pakistan, and this support program, this cash transfer, goes to women. And the prerequisite is that the woman of the household of each family, not of the household of actually each family in the household, the mother of the family, as it were, needs to have an identity card, which many women did not possess until this scheme was introduced. And notionally, they're also meant to have a bank account, but I think the transfers often go directly. But the initial idea was for the woman to have an ID card and a bank account. So one can imagine what kind of pressure that puts on family dynamics to recognize the woman as the person receiving this transfer. It's about 1,200 rupees per month, which is about $12. So again, it's not very much money, but it's not per family, but it's covering 5 million families. So if you multiply a family by 4 or 5 people, again, a very large group of the population is receiving it. In terms of population under the poverty line, having access to this Benazir Income Support grant, it's about 20%, and then there's other elements in it as well. So again, there's sort of a social protection, social policy combined with social inclusion objectives. Oops. So this is a woman holding her identity card. The good news. So there's lots of good news, I would say, around these social policy innovations. It's sort of it's a holistic set of policy reforms that sort of belong together. They're not isolated, although we present them in these silos, but actually they all hang together and relate to each other. It's a systematic acknowledgement of poverty. Obviously, in South Asia, one has always been aware of poverty. If you go back to the constitutions of the late 1940s, the first thing that comes is, enormous poverty, and one has to do something about economic and social justice. But it's actually in systematic policies acknowledging that there's a huge poverty issue. And then, as I already emphasized, there's always, in these South Asian ones, a strong emphasis on social inclusion and having incentives to include those who are disadvantaged. It's using, all of these policies are using this language of right to education, right to health, right to information. And although they're sometimes categorically targeted to children or to girl children or to tribal people, but in terms of the philosophy underlying the policy, they're universalist. The idea is really to address everyone in the country. The child grant in Nepal, for instance, initial design of the government and of different players that were involved was of having a universal child benefit the way we have it, I think, in Switzerland or in the UK and other countries, so that every family that has children is receiving this government transfer. What's also very good is that obviously any kind of policy that's introduced needs tweaking and correcting. Policies introduced at such a huge level need all the more correction, and there's a constant effort to improve the actual measures. Very quickly, the Benazir program in Pakistan originally was money, lump sums given to parliamentarians for their district to then distribute to the poorest in the district. You can imagine that that's a pretty dicey way of distributing a social protection transfer. It was then completely systematized with sort of a policy, income scorecard and other scores, so that families are actually identified who are the poorest in terms of income flows, but also in terms of assets and capacities. And now there's a national data bank of all people who are eligible for this grant. So there's a big improvement in the delivery of or in the design anyway, of the program. A very important element is that funding is from the fiscal budget in almost all of these programs. So it's not, as I mentioned before, it's not an NGO or an international agency coming and doing something. It's actually in the fiscal budget. It has a budget line, so as I already mentioned, it's very hard to then dismantle this kind of a policy. And there have been increases in the funding over time. This is just about the rights of people. In India, they also introduced a card similar to the Pakistan model, a card upon which you receive your entitlements. And I think this is also the voting card. I'm not sure if it's 1 year.
It's the Aadhaar card.
Yeah, is it for voting as well, or it's only for the social transfer? Okay, so that one has a more, sort of an objective measure of who's receiving, and you can sort of track it in a very high-tech fashion. Also part of the good news is that the share of social expenditures, or at least the allocation, in the fiscal budgets of these countries is very high. Most of you weren't around when we had the Copenhagen Social Summit in 1995, but there it was decided that 20% of a fiscal budget has to go to the social sector. Here we see that in all the countries except Bangladesh, so in Bhutan, India, Sri Lanka, Maldives, and Nepal, more than 30% of the fiscal budget goes to the social sectors, being health, education, housing, and social protection, including social insurance. So that's a pretty good accomplishment, and again, one reason why we see sort of a change in social policy and maybe something like a South Asian type of welfare state.
I forget what you said. Maldives.
Maldives, yeah. And also positive is that, because we're talking about rights, that all the major UN conventions on women's rights, children's rights, tribal rights, rights of people with disability, they've been ratified in almost all the countries, which is a positive international corroboration of the national speak around rights. But there's also bad news. First of all, as in any policy, we have wonderful policies, but the intention and the design are often far removed from the actual delivery, and there's lots of not just hiccups, but really, problems. Theoretically or conceptually, the problem with any kind of these social policies that I've been describing, not any, but many of them, are that they're very individualizing. When I was younger and working in different parts of the UN, it was all about structural change of an entire village or even an entire region, and the funds were going into economic development with the assumption that that would then help the entire community to have employment and access to land, etc. This is very much policy at the individual household and family level. The benefit levels are very low, and an evaluation was just done of the Nepal Child Grant and found that the money is good for some extremely poor families that hardly have cash in very remote areas, but for most families this 200 rupees per month is not enough to really make any kind of dent in the household income. It's about 20% of the poverty line. Some of these policies, positive as they are, that they're looking at social exclusion, are also have the risk of cementing, putting you into that box. She's a Dalit, she's from the most disadvantaged caste. This is a girl child, so we need to help her. We know it from those of us who work in the UN. We get a promotion, we said, it's only because you're a woman. They don't really. And so there's always that problem with cementing. If you recognize an exclusion, a vector of exclusion, that might actually turn against. And on the flip side of that, there's some issues of exclusion that are not addressed. India, I mentioned, has education grants for minority religion children. The other countries don't. So in Nepal, for instance, where the Muslim communities are often actually worse off worse off than the most disadvantaged caste. There's no special attention to Muslim communities in terms of an education grant or cash transfers, etc. And again, it might be a problem to do that, but just interesting that there's some blind spots on what kind of exclusion is actually addressed. I'll say something more in a minute about social policy versus human rights legislation, but first on the structural omissions. I already said it's individualizing. There aren't really very systematic labor policies for decent work and minimum wages. The new government in India that was inaugurated yesterday is saying, this employment scheme, this very famous Mahatma Gandhi employment scheme, it's not really creating proper jobs in the formal economy in the cities, in the IT sector, in creative industries and manufacturing, etc. There's no land reform. There's nothing about changing the asset situation. So while the income situation is addressed, but there's nothing really about the more significant forms of creating poverty, which is lack of access to land or water or other resources. There's a lot of fiscal omissions. So there has been there's this very good trend that the social sector captures a lot of the fiscal budget, but there hasn't been a tax reform. There hasn't been any form of trying to raise the tax revenue of governments, except in Nepal. And there hasn't been any talk about progressive taxation, which would be important to also address all these income inequalities and asset inequalities. And there has not really been a decisive health sector reform. So, as I already said, in so many countries, if a health calamity hits a family, it is very difficult to recover from the expenses, apart from the grief, but to recover from the expenses. And so despite these different transfers and despite the universalizing of access to health, there isn't really enough done to reform the health sector. We're in the bad news part. So I said before how so much of the budget within the fiscal budget is devoted to social expenditure, but then the budget of the government is very low, much lower than we know in other welfare states. So overall, the average is around 15% of the GDP is actually government revenue or expenditures. And within that, we then have about 6 or 7% for the social sector if we measure the social expenditures as a share of GDP. So it's very low. And because these expenditure or the shares of government in GDP are so low, the actual expenditure per capita for the social sector, which looks so good when you look at the fiscal budget, looks a lot less good when you start saying how much is it because the share of GDP is so low. So just to emphasize that point, health expenditure and education expenditures, when we measure them as a share of GDP, are global lows. And the same for social protection expenditures, around 2% of GDP, which again is probably the lowest in the world. And quickly on again, another flip side of the rights-based discussion, while the human rights conventions have been adopted and ratified, the labor-related conventions have not. And we see gaps for almost all of these policy areas that would actually relate to decent work and addressing poverty and inclusion when we moved to the labor market. What have been the drivers of these social policy innovations? I said they all started around 2004. That was when there was a big shift in the government of India, moving to a progressive alliance of Congress and other left-wing parties, which is sort of the contextual trigger. All of the countries had a regime change, not just India, but in Bangladesh and Pakistan when moved to a civilian government. Maldives had its first multi-party elections in 2008, I think it was. Nepal and Sri Lanka moved out of civil war into a peaceful situation. There was a big change in the overall political situation, the countries opening up space for policy reform. Economically, there was a lot of dynamism because of high growth rates, even until after the big global recession, 9%, 10% growth rates, opening up again space for policy reform. Political economy-wise, South Asia is a very argumentative region. As Amartya Sen once said, there are very many civil society organizations, there's trade unions, there's been a lot of agitation in terms of marches, strikes, interventions to parliamentarians, etc., to get these different innovations to happen. So it wasn't the government thinking, oh, let's do a universal midday meal. It was movements of different interest groups who put a lot of pressure on the government and then made it happen. And then there's, I guess, something like zeitgeist, this interest in social policy, perhaps because of the MDGs, perhaps because of greater inequalities becoming visible, so that many, many countries moved into this social policy area. Can you give me 5 extra minutes, otherwise I have to speak so fast.
You show.
How do we interpret all this? So we see this surge of new policies and this, these innovations, and a certain excitement from 2004 onwards in the different countries. We see policy spilling, diffusing from one country to another, like the 100-day work schemes. And so, is it positive or negative? If we're negative about it, we would say it's just a tactic to calm down citizens. There's more inequality, there's more social injustice, there's persistent social exclusion. So all of these policies with their social inclusion lens, etc., are just a way to assuage the population. They're a palliative. They don't really change the structure. Even if a family receives all of these grants, because they're entitled to all of them, they would still be in poverty, when they reach pension age. So is it just constructing consent or assent in South Asia and making people less hostile to their government or more supportive of the government? The positive reading would be there's an ideational shift. We see a complete change in the philosophy driving driving policy change. A concerted effort to more progressive policies, moving away from a sort of very patronizing approach of the government to its citizens, saying, okay, here's some education, here's some health, to saying, actually, we're going to try and empower the citizens and even the residents of the countries, the migrant workers and others. We're going to empower them to actually claim their rights, to make it justiciable. So, what is it? What is it? And, are we falling into a trap by believing this is a good thing, or are we being too critical? I would say it's actually both. I think it's both assuaging and a palliative and construction of consent, and it's also really a change, because policies are adopted for many different reasons, and they're not homogenic, and the factors driving them are not homogeneous. The elites and the bureaucracies are split. In India, we had on the one hand a big drive for all these very big innovations and transformations, if one wants to say that. At the same time, we have in that same Congress party a neoliberal wing that all the time was saying, no, this is too much for the poor, we don't need this. And the new government in India, I think, it'll be interesting to see what happens. But I do think having so many policies coming in, it's changed the understanding that citizens have of what government is about. They're beginning to claim their rights. There's people there's parts of governments being taken to court for not delivering, and it's moving sort of in a more progressive direction, because people see there are all these policies, there are all these promises, there are all these commitments. What's happening on the ground? So just to come back to the issue at the beginning, the 3 questions: is there a common set of ideas and norms that sort of are peculiar or particular to South Asia? Is there a developmental welfare state in South Asia? And is there a rights-based approach? I think on a common set of ideas, yes, I would say, and because we have these policy transmissions, etc., I do think there's something emerging that's common. So back to Sarah Cook, we'll ask her afterwards whether she sees any commonalities that are worth saying there is a sort of a particular South Asian approach to development and welfare policy. Are we seeing a developmental welfare state that's actually combining the social and the economic development? I would say no, because I think these policies don't come together. And is there a rights-based approach? I would say maybe, in the sense that all of them use rights language, and it's an anchor for future action. So, yes, no, maybe is my answer. And finally, what's the next challenge? It's really about keeping the momentum and the direction of change, even if it's not enough, even if it's not a structural transformation as we would want, as UNRISD would want, action for policy change, research and action, I would say, for policy change, but it is about ring-fencing, containing, and maintaining the policies that have been adopted, even if they're not enough, but making sure they don't get dismantled as one moves forward. So thank you very much. And these people in the bulletin are registered.